It's time for February reading wrap-up thing. I read a ton in February. Like, I don't even know how it happened. I just read a lot of books. Here are all the books I read in February. I told you it was a lot. The first book that I read in February was actually a reread. I reread We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, and oh my gosh. If you read this book and you enjoyed it the first time, do a reread of it because the foreshadowing is insane. I found myself, like, during this reread, and I already know what happened, like, reading a sentence and being like, what? The second book I read was Gayle Forman's new book, I Was Here, and I also loved this. It's about a girl whose best friend commits suicide and she didn't see it coming and has to go pack up her friend's stuff and ends up trying to find out, like, what went down. And the thing that I really loved about this book was that it ended up not being as much a suicide book as it ended up being a book about friendship and living and being here. The third book that I read in February was Eureka Man by Alan Hirshfeld, and it is subtitled The Life and Legacy of Archimedes. Archimedes is my favorite mathematician. I'm a nerd, I know, but I love him, and so I was excited. I picked this book up at the Strand bookstore in New York last summer, and I was really excited to read it because I wanted to find out more about Archimedes, and I was pretty disappointed. So, like, the first two chapters summarize Archimedes' life quickly and don't give any information that you wouldn't already know. Then the rest of the book is actually a story of, like, the travels and the journey of one of Archimedes' long-lost manuscripts. It wasn't what the book was advertised as, and so most of the book was just a history of this manuscript. The Archimedes palimpsest is what it's called. And it was interesting, but not what I was expecting, so I was a little bit disappointed. The fourth book that I read in February was Fantasyland by Sam Walker, subtitled A Season on Baseball's Lunatic Fringe. And this was a surprise in the other direction from Eureka Man, in that I only picked this up at a library book sale because I am writing the sports stats class for my students this year, and I thought that this might have some interesting stuff on fantasy baseball, but it was super fascinating. It's kind of the history of how fantasy baseball, which was the first of the fantasy sports, came to be, and it follows the journey of the author who got invited to join one of the super elite fantasy baseball leagues in the country, and, like, it tells of his season while also telling the story of, like, the history of fantasy baseball in general, and it was really fascinating. Oh, okay. The fifth book that I read in February was The Shadow Cabinet by Maureen Johnson, the third book in the Shades of London series, which I love, and I've been waiting very impatiently for this book for months. These books are so fascinating because they're embedded with all of this rich history of London and all this other stuff, but then also it's a modern day, like, mystery story, and crazy stuff happens. One of the game day guys just picked Wichita State to beat you and I on my muted TV, so I'm a little upset and distracted. This book just kept building on the suspense and the intrigue of the first two books, and, you know, the thing happened at the end of the second book, and everyone wanted a resolution to the thing, and oh my gosh, Maureen just resolved something. So, fourth book, please? Because I need to know how this resolves. I can't count. The sixth book that I read this month, is different. Fantasy like you haven't read since Lord of the Rings. It's suspenseful, it's original, it's terrifying at times, because you think that just everyone's gonna die within the next 10 pages, and then they don't, or sometimes someone does. I mean, these are like 700-page books, and I just can't stop reading them. So I'm excited to move on to the 4th one and just keep trucking through this series. If you haven't heard of The Wheel of Time or like fantasy and haven't read it, read it. The 8th book that I read in February is Big Little Lies by Liane Moriarty, which I loved. This book is actually kind of like We Were Liars for adults. It starts off describing the fact that someone got murdered at the elementary school trivia night fundraiser. And it doesn't say who got murdered, and it doesn't say how, and it doesn't say who did it. It just said someone got murdered. And at the start or the end of each chapter, there are these little snippets from these journalistic interviews about the murder. So you kind of get these like little snippets of like drama and what happened, but then it time jumps back to several months before the trivia night fundraiser and starts talking about all of these parents of these elementary school kids and their lives. And I loved the murder mystery aspect of it, first of all. I loved the fact that we didn't know who died, so you were trying to figure out not only who did it, but who got killed the whole time. And then also, I loved the fact that more than being a murder mystery, it was really a story about the moms, the women in the book, and their individual struggles. Domestic violence is a heavy theme in this book, so if you would be uncomfortable reading about very realistically described domestic violence and its resulting issues, don't read this. I don't know if you can see this, but the spine came this way, and it's like cut down the middle in this little curvy thing. And when I first took the jacket off so that I could read it and saw this, I was like, maybe I cut it when I opened the box, but then I realized that that was impossible because the jacket's intact. And so then I spent a long time trying to figure out if this was intentional or not. So if anyone knows if this is like a thing for this book, that the spine is cut, because it kind of looks intentional, like, let me know. And the final book that I read in February was Mathletics by John D. Barrow, and it was the one book that I really did not enjoy. The quote on the front of the book says, "A fast-paced, lighthearted book that revels in the brainier side of brawn." And then also the way that it's described on the back makes you think that it's going to be like a very layperson friendly, anyone could pick this up and read it. That's not what happened. It says 100 amazing things you didn't know about the world of sports. That makes it seem like it's going to be like trivia facts. It's 100 different sections, and each one describes some sort of mathematical or scientific thing in a sport. Some of the excerpts were very interesting and very well explained. Some of them were basically just like, here's an application of this physics formula that you can use with sports, I don't think. Also, it read very technically, like, not well explained to someone who is not very familiar with manipulating formulas and stuff like that. This book could have been so much, and it wasn't. Happy March reading!